Welcome back to the Human First podcast with me, Adrian Murphy. Today I'm delighted to be sitting with Mark Beaumont. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me in.
Yeah, no, thanks for coming. It's great to have you. I'm sure everybody watching and listening probably aware of you and your exploits. I've seen you speak, and I've read your first book, and I think it'd be interesting to know kind of prior to all the stuff that people might know you for. Where did you start out? What's your origin story?
Well, it's quite fun being back here in a studio in Glasgow, because part of my origin story is in the West. Mum was Kilmacombe, just outside Glasgow. Mm-hmm. My first memories were down in Argyll. My dad was a dairyman, working on the farm down on the road down to Campbelltown. And my childhood story was being homeschooled. So in terms of the fact that I've got a public profile now and spend so much of my life in front of people and on stage is sort of deeply ironic for a guy who might as well have sort of grown up in an Enid Blyton book, sort of in the middle of nowhere, and my pals were my sisters and the goats and the chickens. So it was a pretty remote and alternative is strange, because my childhood is all that I know, so it's hard to compare it. But comparing it to the childhood that my children are having, it was very different. Small organics farm, homeschooling, homeopathy, wonderful, but quite alternative in many ways.
Oh, that's brilliant. I guess that's quite unusual these days. That there won't be too many people with that kind of background.
Well, actually, in the COVID years, there was a huge uptick in homeschooling.
True.
I'm hugely passionate about education and the choices that young people make in their lives, which perhaps is not the conversation that you're hoping to have today. But, I've been heavily involved throughout my adult life in just trying to help organizations think about how we help young people, take the opportunities they're given and then build on top of education in a traditional sense, like what you learn and how good you are at solving stuff, and then just build in personal choice, quiet confidence. What's the life you actually want to lead? And so it was interesting off the back of the COVID years, the uptick in homeschooling. And I think, we live in a strange and interesting time in terms of geopolitics in the world. And I think there are people thinking differently about education. Yeah. I wouldn't choose to homeschool my kids, but my wife's a teacher. We live in Edinburgh. They have, just an incredibly sociable life compared to the one I had growing up. But I have to credit the childhood I have with a lot of the independence and a lot of the determination, I guess, that it took for me to very much plough my own furrow from a pretty early age.
I think the resilience is something that we talk about a lot in our business. We have young people coming out of universities, and it's one of those traits that it's hard to test for it, obviously, but it's one of those things you see less and less, and it actually helps you stand out. And that's something that you must have developed, given, your childhood and then what you went on to do. That would have been a big part of it, I guess.
Yeah. And I think resilience is two things, isn't it? One is a work ethic. Mm-hmm. So I think growing up on the farm is hugely useful because you're very physical.
Yeah.
So I think it's very useful for children to learn physical chores, to do stuff, whether it's, peeling a bag of potatoes or mucking out a horse's box or, building a dry stone dike, having chores and completing chores, stacking the wood. I think a work ethic and completing on a task, especially one which is repetitive, because actually life is full of things which are quite repetitive and you've got to be able to think it through. So I think one part is a work ethic. And I think that only comes through physical application. We live in a very distracted world with screens and social media. And I think for young people to learn the skill of sticking with a task is one part of resilience, which is not often talked about, because resilience is normally about, how good you are at just, doing hard stuff. Yeah. But part of it is actually monotony and routine. And the other part for me is accountability. And so resilience is around, there's a massive difference in life between knowing what to do and doing it. The world is full of people with amazing CVs, and all it means when you read somebody's CV is, I was there, I was there is not the same as that's what I did. So you can talk about all the amazing companies you worked for and the roles that you had, but that doesn't for a second say what you actually did. You know, your personal responsibility, your ability to think creatively, the trust that people put in you. I'll give you an extreme example. You know, when I rode the Atlantic and we capsized, there was 6 of us, and we were all trained for a disaster. We were all trained for a Mayday situation. But when things went the wrong way up, regardless of the training we'd done and the tickets we had, only 2 out of the 6 did what was necessary for us to survive. Now, all 6 of us would tell you the same story. They would all tell you an amazing story of survival in the Atlantic, and we're all sort of guilty of seeing what we want to see in people. So if somebody was to tell you an amazing story about capsizing in the Atlantic, you would see bravery, you would see resilience, you would see tenacity, you go, my goodness, I'll hire them because of what they've been through. I was there. That doesn't tell you a thing about what they said, what they did, how they acted in that situation. And I hire people in my team very differently today based on different questions, not just sort of assume. It's not that just seeing what I want to see and really understanding people's ability to not just know what to do, but have that learned experience to step forwards and not step back when things go wrong. So I think the work ethic bit is never talked about. I think it's always just around accountability, but I think you need both.
Can you give me an example of that, of how you might, what kind of question you might ask somebody then if you're talking to them?
When you're interviewing somebody, it's very easy to spot when somebody gets on their hobby horse. You're like, here's something they've talked about before. They're in a very comfortable flow state and they're talking about something which is an anecdote they know well. You know, I just did it myself because I've told that Atlantic story before. and actually stopping somebody in their track and asking them the opposite question, a different question, a difficult question, taking them to a place, or asking around personal responsibilities as opposed to what did the team do. And I think when you really push the button on what individuals did, and really sort of jump up and down on that button until you understand individual behaviors. Because when we're in high pressure situations, the way you think, the way you communicate, and the way you act in that order changes. So you become more negative, you become less relevant, you become a distraction to the team. All the things which are quite natural. So we sort of build in life an ability to tolerate stress, whatever that looks like, financial, it could be something that's genuinely life-threatening, or it could be just sleep deprivation, whatever stress looks like for you. And then we build sort of coping mechanisms based on whether there's anything in our life that we can sort of remember similar. Like, okay, I've been here before. That allows me to be relevant in this situation. But to your question, I think I'm much better now at spotting my own familiarity bias. I'm not just liking somebody because they sort of look like me and sound like me, and they're talking about something with, a huge amount of, fluency. And at that point I go, okay, what sits beneath that, or what are they not talking about because that's comfortable? It's
well rehearsed, or
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess then going back to you and your kind of your upbringing, you must have, I guess, over the piece, and we're going to touch on all the things that you've done, but did kind of goal setting come into that at quite an early age in terms of your ambition, or being quite clear about what it was you wanted to do? When were you kind of aware of starting to think like that?
I think it's really, really important to not tell this story with hindsight and tell it as I lived my life, because with hindsight, I think a lot of my career looks quite inevitable and quite professional and quite sure-footed, and that's not how life feels as you're taking it on. So I think it's really important not to agree violently with you and say, yes, I was incredible at goal setting at the age of 10. No, of course I wasn't.
The age of 10, that's like all.
Exactly. So let's be honest here. I've never been very competitive in a team dynamic. So I think probably from my homeschooling, for me, the wanderlust came first.
The
sense of adventure came first. The want to explore. So for me, I think a sense of ambition and goal setting probably came from just wanting to push myself. And when I was really young, just this idea of going on adventures was enough. Even when I went to high school, I was terrible at rugby and football, and it certainly wasn't trying to beat other people around me. I was never in a cycling club. I was never trying to race anyone. For me, it was genuinely sort of the wanderlust and the adventure of it. And, I was 12 when I pedaled across Scotland, and a couple of things happened there. I was given the inspiration because I'd read about somebody who had done Land's End John O'Groats, and I wanted to do that. And I thought, just from a newspaper article, that sounds fun. And my mum said, why don't you try something smaller first, and pedal across Scotland. And then when you're young, I think a lot of your sort of affirmation in terms of who you are comes with recognition. People recognize you for who you are. And, my fondest memories from riding across Scotland is not actually the ride, but is afterwards handing over a charity cheque to Princess Royal, getting the recognition from mates at school. I was really struggling with the transition from homeschooling to school. And this was probably the first thing I'd done in my life where people turned around to me and said, wow, that's pretty cool, Mark. And, for a little kid, that means something.
Yep.
So of course I pursued that. Of course I was like, oh, I want another hit of that. I want, and of course it becomes part of your identity if it's something that people respect you for, certainly at a time where you're figuring out who you are. And then my parents divorced when I was 16. By that point, I think I knew myself better as a young person. But my parents divorcing was hugely formative, because I then became very sort of defiant, as all young men do, in terms of who I wanted to be and what I didn't want to be, and the emotions of that. So, with 25 years hindsight, it's interesting to think back to the young Mark Beaumont and what was happening at school and family that made me go, actually, doing stuff that's mine. Doing these big projects that I own, I'm in charge of my own destiny, and it wasn't just sort of positive motivation in terms of what I wanted to do and wanted to be, but it was also negative motivation, parts of what I was running away from, which is fine. And there's nothing negative about negative motivation. It's quite helpful to sometimes define yourself by what you don't want to be. And there were certainly things that was happening in my late teenage years that made me fiercely independent, hugely protective of my mum and my sisters and my family, and wanting to really step out. And that makes me sound very alpha, and I don't think I am, because I'm still not a very sort of competitive person in the traditional sense of the word. But I definitely found, more so in my 20s, this real hunger to define every period. I wanted every year to have something that I wasn't just existing. I wasn't just getting by and paying the rent. I was doing stuff every year that I could sort of punctuate time by. And this idea of sort of living life by projects and sprints, and this idea of doing stuff that had, a community around me, whether it was my family or my team members or the media teams that I worked with, I became slightly obsessed in my 20s about these sort of like, every period of time needs to matter, and I need to have relevance to the things I care about. I've maybe mellowed a little bit in that regard, but it is interesting looking back to my career in my 20s and realise that I wasn't really racing anyone. I was just being fiercely competitive with myself and trying to do these projects year on year that mattered and made a difference and shifted the dial.
Was that, take it as you said, were you probably weren't conscious of doing it, but it was probably distracting you from something else, doing those projects? As you say, it's not a bad thing.
No, I don't think it is a bad thing. We all have negative and positive motivations in our lives. And I think what's quite interesting about my career is I've spent half my life doing this and on stage and making television. And I've spent half my life completely on my own. I've spent thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of hours on my own, in my own head. I've done expeditions that are 6-9 months long on my own, chatting occasionally to a camera. So I'm very, very comfortable in front of thousands, and I'm also very comfortable on my own and in silence. And talking to young people now, they're always fascinated by those periods of time when you're on your own. People often say, do you not get lonely? Do you not get bored? Do you not find it incredibly difficult to just pass these sort of periods of time? And I think that's an interesting perspective. You don't need to be a professional adventurer. I think it's very healthy for people to spend time in their own head. And I would encourage anyone listening to this to, have their phone in their pocket, but don't look at it, and go and spend a day in the hills. and go on a long bike ride. And even if you don't want to do something physical, go and spend a day and a night in the outdoors and just try and be with your own company for more than 12 hours, ideally 24 hours or 48 hours. Just do something where you're outside in the elements for enough time for your mind to slightly de-scramble.
Yeah.
And I think there's something incredibly special about that, which allows you to think through things which your mind doesn't, because we think on a very conscious level a lot of the time, but a lot of our real sort of problem solving, a lot of our sort of intuition, a lot of our wisdom comes from something which happens at a deeper level. And that's not spiritual, that's just the way our mind is wired up. And people always joke that their best ideas happen when they're walking the dog, but it's true. If you don't give your head time to really sort of absorb the situations you're in life, it's very hard to have a North Star in terms of, okay, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that, because you're not giving yourself time to really sort of step back from the coalface, if that makes sense.
I think in danger of this becoming a different podcast altogether, I'm actually really purely selfishly, of course, but to dig into that a wee bit, because it's something that I think everybody can relate to. Constant distraction, the dopamine hit, all this stuff that we're all kind of aware of that these devices give us. And I can totally relate to what you're saying in my own, going out on a bike, for example. I go out on a bike I'm aware that I might be out for 2 or 3 hours and come back. I didn't actually think of anything, but I now have the solution to a problem that I'd been trying to solve, but I didn't need to try and solve it. It worked its way through. Now, you've spent a lot more time than I have, obviously, in that space. So what's going on for you at that time? And do you see a benefit from that?
I think often, it's not the direct answer, but often you're not fixing problems in the practical way that you're alluding to, but it's often reframing stuff. So stuff that really bothers you, really is upsetting you, is prioritizing your emotions, often get restructured when you've got time out. So your mind has time to sort of like contextualize things and reframe things, and just chills you out a wee bit.
Yeah,
because
that's probably better. That's a better way of putting it.
Yeah.
Actually.
So the stuff that really bothers you becomes less of an emotive response, and the stuff that's been slightly buried but it's actually really important, you maybe have time to think about. So I think often time in the outdoors is about reordering your thoughts and your priorities, and maybe hopefully coming back a bit more present and a bit more relevant.
Just thinking about when you were, cycling around the world or cycling through Africa, what were you back home? What was going on? What professionally, personally? Because you've got to leave all that behind, and so how do the two of those kind of interact?
I'm acutely aware there might be people watching and listening who have no idea who I am.
Maybe we should do that. Actually, we should do the intro.
So yeah. I mean, short story, so I can answer your question properly, is I spent the first 15 years of my life doing expeditions to 130 countries. I've cycled around planet Earth twice, length of the Americas, length of Africa. Tried to road the Atlantic, through the Arctic, high altitude mountaineering, doing daft stuff like riding a bike down the world's highest volcano. So I spent 15 years doing big expeditions of all sorts, but I'm best known as a bike rider. So in answer to your question of like what was happening in that sort of juggle of life, it depends what period of my career you're talking about. When I left Glasgow University here and I set off around the world the first time, I was completely sort of footloose and carefree and no ties at all. I had my mum back here around the kitchen table with a map and a mobile trying to sort out, armed escorts around the Afghan border. It was all quite rock and roll. Whereas, by the time I'm 10 years later and going around the world the second time, I'm married, I've got, a daughter, and I've got a mortgage and a business and responsibilities and all the rest of it. So I certainly took big risks, entrepreneurial risks, at the right time in my career. It would be very hard to fall out of bed sort of now in my early 40s and decide to do what I did in my early 20s.
If only.
but yes, that constantly changed. People always say to me after watching my TV programs and reading my books and hearing me talk, Mark, I would love to do what you do. And I always sort of, not unkindly, but I say, I think you like the idea of what I do, because they see the certainty of results. They see when I'm out there breaking world records, doing world firsts, making TV programs. And because they're reading the outcomes, they're seeing the certainty of success. What they're not living is, how do you turn that acorn of an idea into something that actually happens? They never see, the tens of projects that never get funded, the tens of projects that never get commissioned for televisions, the tens of ideas that never got started. And, even those that, a third of my expeditions failed. And I don't think people look at my career and go, Mark Beaumont was a failure.
No.
I only ever turned back because it was unsafe to carry on, or because, because a significant accident happened. I never failed because I gave up. But it's interesting how other people perceive my career and how I see my career. Yeah. To your point on the previous question, when you're spending, the second time around the world in 80 days, I was 1,100 hours of time trialing. So when people say, I'd love to do what you do, when that's in a 1 hour TV documentary, you're racing 240 miles a day, it looks quite, quite mad and quite wonderful. And I guess when you're sitting there at your desk, it does look like wonderful escapism. But the reality of, having skin in the game, financing that, building a team of 40, spending 2.5 years planning it, and then ultimately trying to get around the planet 37% quicker than anyone's ever done it before. There's no reference point for that. People thought I was mad. When I sat on the red sofa at BBC Breakfast and told the world that we were going to do this, people thought we were nuts. Yeah. You can go back and search the articles and social media that was written about me at the time. And it was only afterwards people go, wow, we always knew he was going to do it. And look, he's done it. And so therefore and everyone just takes that as the new standard for success. But that's not how people are talking about it before you do it. So it's having that creativity and that confidence to create a different future and to build a team around that. I'm not standing up, but I'm 6'3" and 95 kilos. I don't look like a bike rider. Yep. And so, I don't rely on sort of some gifted talent
as genetics.
Genetics. I think a lot of people think, you're just a phenomenal bike rider. I'm an all right bike rider, but there's better bike riders in Scotland. My ability to systematically break records over my career was not because of my talent on the bike. It was because I thought about the scale of the projects differently. I resourced it differently. I think most project teams have that familiarity bias of just seeing it through the lens of their own technical expertise. Mm-hmm. So a cyclist will say, well, I'll train harder than I've ever trained before, and I'll figure out what I'm capable of. Whereas my logistics manager thinks it's all about, weather routing and flight patterns, and my finance director thinks it's purely about, getting the right the right resourcing for it. Mm-hmm. And I guess, if you think of the 40 people working on that project, they all have their own bit of the puzzle, and they're all correct to say that their bit is fundamentally important, but the whole puzzle needs to work. Yeah. And we broke the round the world record by 37%, but we broke our target by 1.44%, and that is a stat that nobody talks about, because everyone just looks at, well, you went around the world in 78 days, breaking the 123-day record. Nobody realizes that we were targeting 80 and we came home in 78 days, 14 hours and 40 minutes. And I think that is the truth that I always try and remind people of. And how do you stand in front of your team of 40 and say, we're going to make history here? Because if I was to say to my team, do you understand how we're going to get around the world in 80 days? They'd go, yes, Mark. But they don't. That's the wrong question to ask them. They've never cycled around the world before. Do they understand their job, and do they understand how you add all this sort of capacity and skill set up and you do something fundamentally different? And the thing that's always excited me as an architect for these projects is, how do you create a different future? How do you create a different future? How do you learn from others but not base your targets on what other people have done? Most businesses, most athletes, most everyone in life, and it's human psychology, their reference point for success is better than last time. Yep. And it's incredibly difficult to have the creativity and the confidence to say, I've learned from that, I respect that, now how can you fundamentally do it differently? And people talk about values, but what I much prefer talking about is behaviors. What do you do each day in small incremental parts which take you to a completely different place? Yeah. That's the exciting bit.
Maybe it'd be good to get an example, because I know, things have gone wrong along the way, right? So it's all well and good. We're sitting here today and you can say, yeah, you're consistent, trust the process, we've planned it all out. But then, you fall off your bike and break your arm or, there's a million things that have gone wrong. So it'd be quite, what, if you've got an example of where that's happened, and what were you thinking at the time and how did you stay consistent and manage your emotions when something's gone basically shit's hit the fan?
Well, I think there's two sorts of crisis. There's one which is a moment in time, which is like a crash on the
Yeah.
bike. So
Yeah.
we're talking about the 80 days. So let's stick with that. Day 8, just east of Moscow, crash the bike, fracture my radial head and break some teeth. So that is relatively early on in the race. And it's absolutely a moment where I thought, can I carry on? But as human beings, I think we all have quite a good inbuilt fight or flight. When we have a moment in time where the wheels come off. I think we all have the ability to sort of fight against that and create momentum and fix the problems. And, on an incredibly basic level, the adrenal response and the body's ability to fight back and overcome fear and pain and all that is amazing. We've all got that.
Yeah.
I think so then you have to think, well, what's safe? Is it safe to carry on?
Yeah.
Have I delegated that responsibility to people who are not emotional? So I have to trust my logistics manager. I have to trust my performance manager. It's just like in my businesses now. You have to trust your FDs. You have to trust you have to trust people around you who aren't necessarily, quite in the crosshairs the way you are, to give you the right advice and to give you the right support for big decisions. Nobody does these things on their own, but we all have the ability in a crisis point to sort of rally and fight back and get back on track. I think actually, people always say, how do you fight back in those toughest moments? I think weirdly those bits which sound awful when you're breaking yourself are perhaps easier than the opposite. And the opposite is just long periods of time where you've got a metaphoric headwind or a real headwind, or you've just got breaks on progress. If you're talking about weeks and months where it's just the sheer attrition of the scale of what you're taking on, and there's nothing specific to fight against, there's no adrenal response, there's no crisis, it's just hard. And I think, that level of stress and suffering and, conviction to see it through is almost harder because you don't have a focal point for that suffering. And I often think in these big races, and I think the same in entrepreneurship and business building, it is about suffering, which sounds a bit sort of heroic and daft, but you've got to be able to suffer well. And the stuff that's really sort of career defining and life affirming is when you look back and said, not just I was there, but that's what I did. Your ability to think your way through those periods of times where other people just throw in the towel. And I'll give you one more example. GB Duro, which was the gravel race from Land's End to John O'Groats, 2,000 kilometres. It's one of the only races I've ever done in my life. I was a Shimano athlete for a long time, and Shimano asked me in the heart of lockdown when we weren't allowed to fly abroad, so I couldn't do any international stuff, if I could do GB Duro. So I'd never stood on a start line with other athletes because I'd always ever just done expeditions. There was 60 of us who left Land's End, 2,000 kilometres off-road pretty much to John O'Groats. By the time we got there, 13 people finished. 13. And I looked around me and I went, what happened to 47 people? Like, the bikes didn't break, they didn't get ill. 47 people along that sort of long and winding road stopped riding the road in front of them. And it really gave me thought and pause as to how people think about the scale of these sort of projects they take on, because everyone's got the dream of the prize. Everyone's got the dream of the finale. It could be a founder with their big exit. It could be a climber with their Everest. It could be whatever the hell it is in life. We all want the result, but actually the work to get it is something that when people say to me, I want to row the Atlantic or I want to build a business, I will never be somebody to sort of in any way dampen that ambition. But I do always sort of try and check their references. I say, do you have any idea what you're taking on? Because if you want to climb Everest, have you climbed a Monroe? If you're going to row the Atlantic, have you spent a night in a rowing boat before? If you're going to start a business, have you ever sold anything? Yeah. And I think having a reference point for what you're trying to do is always very, very important, because it's the same with any career. We all like the results. We all like the idea of whatever that might be, freedom,
Yeah.
money,
Yeah.
adoration, whatever it is. But the life that you lead is a very different thing than the results that you aspire to. And I think making sure that you're not just fixated on the results that you'll never get to if you don't understand the lived bit is pretty fundamentally important. I think the most important thing in life is feeling like you've got a level of control and that you're in the driving seat for what you do. People asked me during the COVID lockdowns, oh, you must be brilliant at this because you're great at overcoming adversity. And I said, it's pointed out that the human nature is we tend to be good at stuff if we feel like we've got a level of agency. And when stuff is done to us as opposed to by us, we feel very differently about it. So during that COVID period, I was doing anything I could to grapple back a sense of relevance and control. Because being told to sit at home and sit on the sofa was actually not good for for family, for community, or for work. And so it's a very roundabout way to answer your question, but ever since I was, a student, that's the way I've thought about life. I guess I was fortunate to have a public profile in my early 20s, so it threw me into the public eye and it gave me the opportunity to do things in charity and in education and things that I genuinely care about. But I do encourage anyone who cares to listen to not wait until they're retired before they start to think of investing financially, investing in terms of their time, investing in terms of their communities, because those things, like anything in life, compound. And, the more you create time for more than just one or two things in your life, the more that those things all join up and give you a better sense of who you are. And that will change. Your priorities will change as you get older.
I think it's something we talk about all the time because, I've seen the other side of that where, like you said earlier, people are defined by what they do, right? So it's all encompassing. I throw everything into my work and I have nothing else in my life. Now, the danger with that, of course, is that that might not be there, or you might have a successful end to that, whether it's an exit or you retire, leave that job. Then what? How you defining yourself? Who are you? What's important to you? What's your purpose? Right? And if you haven't already done that work and you get to later in life, it's really, really hard to start at that point.
Yeah. And I think in this conversation, I want to be very careful to not pretend I get that right all the time. As I say, I'm 42 and there's been lots of things that I've invested in my career and I've done things for the right reasons at the time and they've led nowhere. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll give you an example. I took a job with the BBC to lead the build up to the Commonwealth Games in Glasgow in 2014. Sat down with my wife at the time, who was expecting our first, and we decided together this was the right thing to do. I was going to be a TV presenter. I was going to really push my broadcasting career. And this was a wonderful opportunity, representing Scotland, the home games. It was going to be wonderful. Biggest job you could get at the time in the Commonwealth Games. So I went out there, dream job, 9 months, but I missed 9 months of Harriet's first year. I was away for 9 months for her first year. And we did that knowing that, I was investing in our future, my future. And guess what? It led to absolutely nothing. The phone never rang. There was no follow-up projects from the BBC. And I suddenly thought, oh, gosh, I've forfeited 9 months of the first year of my first child's life. And the next year I got back on my bike and broke the Cairo to Cape Town record, the length of Africa. And I can laugh about it now, and Harriet's 11 and she's forgiven me. But I'm joking. But it's interesting that there's lots of things in life that I never originated. But because I was out there doing stuff, opportunities came my way.
Yeah.
And then lots of stuff that I put tons of time and effort into, thinking that A would lead to B, led nowhere. And that's life.
Yeah.
And, my career so far has been lots of daft twists and turns. Hell, I mean, these days I'm a partner in an investment firm. And if you'd told me 6 years ago that this is what I'd be doing, it's a million miles away from. But for me, there is a mad line between it all. And realizing that, when doors shut that you expect to open, it just means you've got to sort of look around, be creative, use that network. And I think there's a massive, massive void between how other people see my career and how I see my career. Yeah. I'm constantly sort of creating these opportunities for others and, spotting for opportunities to join things up. And as I say, there's been nothing linear about my career, even though there's been a lot of projects which have been high profile and, thankfully have been the bedrock of my ability to do other stuff.
And what maybe it's worth touching on your career, I guess, as it is now. The majority of it will be with EOS.
Yeah. So in my 30s, I was an angel investor. I should backtrack and say that I'm patron for Entrepreneurial Scotland,
Yeah.
which is an amazing organisation that gives young students in Scotland the opportunity to do international internships and build that global mindset around their career options. You know, we're a small country, and I think people really need to think global about who they are, even if they're going to stay working in Scotland, just to think big. And I benefited from that when I was a student. I went over and worked in Boston. I've stayed heavily involved with the university sector. I'm honorary president of Scottish Student Sports. I was the former rector at the University of Dundee. So the educational part was already there for me. And as you can probably tell from the conversation thus far, I'm really, really keen to help young people think about the choices they make, not just the education they've got, but the choices they make. What life do you want to lead? So that naturally led for me into investing.
Yeah.
Because I'm not just wanting to give my time and my experience, but I want to invest in young people who have big ideas about business. And that's not just about, their own career trajectories and job creation, but it's also about impact. It's about what is the purpose of these businesses? What are they trying to do? And not to be too grandiose about it, but going as far back as the Scottish Enlightenment, we have been good at creating solutions to big problems. For a small country, we have, for hundreds of years, punched above our weight in terms of science in particular. And of course, because of my previous career, I am asked time and time again to invest in bike brands and, micromobility. And I'm not actually that interested in that.
Yeah.
I've designed bikes with Argon 18. I've helped brands, but in terms of investing my own hard-earned money, I would prefer to invest in science and technology, addressing climate change issues, sustainable agriculture, so we can feed a growing population on planet Earth, address chronic disease states, help with better early stage diagnostics for cancer and other diseases. So the stuff for me, which I think we're very good at in Scotland and the UK, is about innovators really thinking about what are the big global issues and how to address those. But you don't get the impact until you have scale.
Yeah.
So forget the do-goodery for a second. This is about sort of investing money, building teams, and thinking global about businesses. So I was quite interested to put my money where my mouth was and invest, and I started doing that 10 years ago in a modest way. EIS type investing in the Scottish ecosystem. But I got a little bit frustrated because I felt that all the conversations were on the company sides, as in, does it work? Is there a market for it? Is it protectable? Is the founder backable, et cetera, et cetera. So all the risks were talked about on the company side as opposed to the investor side. And the unspoken part of that story is, if you're coming in at the start and backing these entrepreneurs, these founders, then what? The risk on the investor side is massive. Yep. So as these companies go through the gears, are you diluted out of rounds? Are you, are people putting 2 times, 3 times prefs on your early stage risk? You should be getting commensurate return for that early stage risk, ideally keeping a seat at the table and actually being able to help these companies, especially if they're academic founders, build out that international market part. So I liked the space. I liked the fact that I saw lots of opportunities, and because of my network and profile, I was being pitched a lot of stuff, but I just thought, forget the companies for a second. On the investor side, this is really risky. And back in 2019, I started to have a conversation with one of the syndicates that I was a part of, and have a conversation about, was there the opportunity to scale and professionalize EOS? And Andrew McNeil is the managing partner. He was there before me. And we have, since that day, I went from being in the syndicate to helping build the business alongside Andrew. And we've built out the partnership. There's now 14 in our team on both sides of the Atlantic. And we really specialise on driving capital into Scottish startups to then scale companies out of Scotland. And these are really knowledge intensive, IP rich, complicated companies where if an investor says to me, "Oh, I only invest in things I understand," well, I would say, "Well, you don't need EOS then." By definition, we are that we are that bridge
Yeah.
into. In fact, where we're sitting right now, we're a couple of miles from a company where we just completed a growth round. It was a spin out from Strathclyde Uni called Discover, and they specialise in early stage diagnostics for colorectal and brain cancer.
Right.
Absolutely phenomenal. So you imagine healthcare in 5-10 years where pre-symptomatic care will be very different to what it is now. So you won't go to the doctors where you've got a lump and a bump and a symptom. You'll actually have a simple blood test which will tell you if you've got, either solid tumours or circulating cancers, and that'll be a very different state where you can then catch it at sort of phase 1, phase 2 rather than phase 4. So we're investing in the future of healthcare. We just backed an amazing company called Nature Beads to replace microbead plastics to stop plastic pollution in the world's oceans.
Yeah.
So stuff like this. And I've gone from doing it in a personal capacity to now helping lead a company doing it professionally. And I'm sure listeners will realise from the way I talked about it, it's the same thing. Cycling around the world, building high impact companies, it's the same thing. It's surrounding yourself with a team who have the creativity and the dynamism to create a different future, and really have the energy and commitment and consistency to do that. Will it work all the time? Well, I told you before, a third of my expeditions failed, but I don't think people thought I was a failure. And if I could make the next 20 years as ambitious and as difficult as the last 20 years, but in the Scottish investment ecosystem, I think that would be time well spent.
Yeah. You've made a hell of an impact, you would hope, given what you're doing. It's interesting, you talked earlier about people maybe just see you on a bike, for example, and the same way they'll see a potential life-changing piece of technology or an idea or some IP. But what they're not seeing is actually what underpins that, which is the team you built behind you, the attention to detail, the process, understanding that at a very deep level. It's the same for investing. You need to have that bit behind you. The idea, it's fine as an idea, but it's not going to ever come to fruition without that.
No. I mean, I'm not the best bike rider in Scotland, and and I wouldn't say I'm the best investor, but what really sort of pays dividends in the future is ruthless consistency, understanding the scale of the race, and the economy's had a bit of a super cycle off the back of the COVID years.
Yeah.
The geopolitics are a bit messed up at the moment. The world is all sort of in a period like now. I would describe it as sort of squirrels holding onto their acorns. It's a period of a lack of confidence. So there's a lot of people going, not just holding on to their investments because of a lack of liquidity, but just not making choices full stop because they're uncertain of the future. So it's just not a period of time in early 2025 where people are feeling particularly sure-footed about the future. And that, for me, is such an opportunity. It goes to the definition of leadership rather than management. Let's not get political here, but there is a big difference between being a good manager and a good leader. A good manager is somebody who's technically good at their jobs.
Yep.
A leader is somebody who can actually take people with them, paint a different picture for the future, inspire people to think creatively and build confidence to do that. So do I go around telling our investors that things are rosy? No. But what I do say is the acorns that we plant today will bear fruit in 5 to 10 years' time.
Yep.
So let's not sit on our hands. Let's be ruthlessly consistent. We'll build the engine room. We'll look at the best that there is, and let's just be consistent, because for better or worse, the world will be different in 5 to 10 years' time.
If you could go anywhere and do anything for a month with no family or financial worries, so money is no object, right? Where would you go and what would you do? And I suspect this would change depending on when we ask this, but now where you are today, what would be your answer to that?
With the caveat that I've done that a lot in my life.
I know.
I would love, the biggest thing I would love to do is to take my daughters on a proper travel adventure. They've done lots of holidays, but they've not yet, they're 11 and 8, they've not yet done what I would call travel. So they've gone to a place and stayed in
Yep.
You know, stayed in a villa, stayed in a hotel, but they've not travelled. So if I had a month and money was no object, I would take them to Africa. I would probably do a big road trip through South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, maybe head up into Tanzania, and we'd stay with some friends down there, some filmmakers, some people I know, and I would just take them off grid. You know, I would allow them to see the grassroots in Africa, and I would get them to really understand the joy of travel as opposed to just going on holiday. So if I had a month, that's what I'd do.
Fantastic. And it's your turn now, so I need you to leave a question for our next guest, who I don't think I know who that is at this point. So
somebody else called Mark.
Somebody else called Mark. Yeah, we're just doing a run of Marks this season.
Right. We're all creatures of habit, whether we like to believe it or not. What habit have you created in the last year which you think would be useful to share with others?
Very good. I like that one. Yeah, great. Wonderful. Listen, thank you for your time, Mark. That's been brilliant. Again, you know, I keep saying this, but there's so much more I want to do. Probably again more selfishly than anything, dig into some of your experiences. But that was really great, and I'm sure people will take a lot from listening to you. So thank you very much for giving us your time.
A pleasure.